2 Chronicles 26, verse 16, quote, "But when he was strong, his heart was lifted up to his destruction, for he transgressed against the Lord his God, and went into the temple of the Lord to burn incense." Verse 17, "And Azariah the priest went in after him, and with him 80 priests of the Lord, that were valiant men." Verse 18, "They withstood Uzziah the king, and said unto him, It appertaineth not to thee, Uzziah, to burn incense unto the Lord, but to the priests, the sons of Aaron, that are consecrated to burn incense. Go out of the sanctuary, for thou hast trespassed, neither shall it be for thine honor from the Lord God." Verse 21, "And Uzziah the king was a leper unto the day of his death, and dwelt in a several house, being a leper, for he was cut off from the house of the Lord. And Jotham his son was over the king's house, judging the people of the land." Unquote. Romans 13, verses 3 and 4, quote, "For rulers are not a terror to good works, but to the evil. Wilt thou then be afraid of the power? Do that which is good, and thou shalt have praise of the same. For he is the minister of God to thee for good. For if thou do that which is evil, be afraid, for he beareth not the sword in vain. For he is the minister of God, a revenger to execute wrath upon him that doeth evil." In verse 6, "For this cause pay you tribute also, for they are God's ministers, attending continually upon this very thing." Unquote. 1 Peter 2, verse 13, quote, "Submit yourselves to every ordinance of man for the Lord's sake, whether it be to the king as supreme." And verse 14, "Or unto governors, as unto them that are sent by him for the punishment of evildoers, and for the praise of them that do well." Unquote. As our fathers in their acknowledgments had reason to say, quote, "Neither hath it been our care to avoid these things which might harden the king in his evil way, but upon the contrary he hath not only been permitted, but many of us have been instrumental to make him exercise his power in many things tending to the prejudice of religion, and of the covenant, and of the peace and safety of these kingdoms, which is so far from the right way of preserving his majesty's person and authority, that it cannot but provoke the Lord against him under the hazard of both. Nay, under a pretense of relieving and doing for the king, whilst he refuses to do what was necessary for the house of God, some have ranversed and violated most of all the articles of the covenant." Unquote. So, during the unhappy days of the late tyranny, it was the land's sin and shame, and ought to be our sorrow, that men were mounted upon a throne of iniquity, whose main design and practice was to subvert religion and persecute it, to introduce popery itself and slavery, to destroy the nation's liberties, suppress the evangel, and oppress its professors, who enacted and executed manifest injustice, stopped the ministration of justice against idolaters, adulterers, murderers, and other malefactors, and punished equity and duty instead of iniquity, arrogated and obtained a monstrous prerogative above all rights and privileges of parliaments, all laws and liberties, a power to tyrannize as they pleased without control. But as it was their sin who inaugurated Charles II, after such discoveries of his hypocritical enmity to religion and liberty upon his subscription to the covenants, so when he burned and buried that covenant, and degenerated into manifest tyranny, and had raised the very foundation upon which both his right to govern and the people's allegiance were founded, and remitted the subjects' allegiance by annulling the bond of it, it was the land's sin that they continued still to own his authority, when opposite to and destructive of religion and liberty, and of these who appeared in arms at Pentland and Bothwell Bridge, that they put in his interest, with application of the words of the covenant to him, though stated in opposition to it, into the state of the quarrel and their declaration of war, for which, so far as the godly could discern, the Lord put them to shame, and went not forth with their enemies. It was likewise the sin of the land, and a great breach of covenant, that the Duke of York was admitted to the exercise of the royal office against the laws of God and man, being incapable of the covenant qualifications of a magistrate, and being a papist, and so incapable of taking, quote, oath of coronation to maintain the true Protestant religion, and gain stand and abolish popery, unquote, which, for the preservation of the true religion, laws, and liberties of this kingdom is stated in the, quote, 8th Act of Parliament 1, King James VI, that all kings at the reception of their princely authority shall take and swear, unquote. Yet this authority, though inconsistent with and declaredly opposite to religion and liberty, was owned and upheld by paying cess and supplies expressly exacted for upholding tyranny, in the destruction of religion and liberty. And though the Lord did, for a long time, by the tyranny of Charles II and James VII, chastise these covenanted lands, yet there has not been a turning to him that smiteth. But these lands have again transgressed the Lord's commandments and broken this part of the covenant of the Lord, by receiving, admitting, and supporting and subjecting to such for kings and queens over these realms, as want the qualifications required in God's word, and enacted by the righteous and laudable laws of the land, to be in magistrates superior and inferior. which were not brought under covenant ties and obligations, to be for God and religion in their own persons and families, and to advance and perverse the same allenarily in their dominions, but in place thereof have come under oath and obligation to countenance, protect, and advance the Romish superstitions and innovations in the worship of God and government of the Church, which the covenant binds these kingdoms to suppress and extirpate, and in consequence of and in conformity to these obligations to maintain and defend or tolerate and allow prelacy and sectarian errors in their dominions, contrary to the true religion and sound doctrine, contrary to justice and equity, yea, contrary to that trust specially committed to the hands of Christian magistrates, who, for that end, they have the sword given them, that they may be a terror to evildoers, preserve and defend the true religion and professors thereof, and punish and extirpate false religion and heresies, and bring the wheel over the broachers and maintainers and abettors thereof, which did and do exercise an Erastian supremacy over the Church in proroguing and dissolving general assemblies, appointing diets and causing of fasts and thanksgivings, by their civil authority causing them to be kept and observed, which do not impartially execute justice upon all offenders, witness and infrequent indemnities and remissions granted to murderers, as particularly and passing without punishment the persons which perpetrated the inhuman, barbarous, and lawless action of the massacre in Glencoe, which waste and destroy the kingdom by levying men, and raising money for maintaining a long and expensive war, undertaking neither for the advancement of the true religion nor for the advantage and safety of the nation, but in favors of the house of Austria, which hath been and yet continues to be one of the strong pillars of Antichrist's kingdom, and implacable enemies to the true Reformed religion, as appears by the persecution of Protestants in Cilicia, Hungary, etc. And yet, notwithstanding of all this, many in the land of all ranks have sworn to bear true and faithful allegiance to them, without any conditional restriction or limitation, so that it is not possible for them, in a consistency with their oath, to disown their authority and deny them subjection, or refuse to defend their persons in government, albeit they should proceed to the greatest pitch of arbitrariness, which is very far from the defense promised to magistrates in the covenant. The whole land, almost, hath complied with them in all the forementioned particulars so diametrically opposite to the covenants, and supported, strengthened, and encouraged them in these evil courses by paying them cess and other subsidies. And ministers have minded so much to be loyal to their government that they have forgotten to be faithful to their souls, in that they have not discovered to them the sin and danger of patronizing prelacy and exercising Erastianism over the Church, but in order to obtain their favor have clapped their hands in these sins, which certainly is most opposite to the loyalty which we ought to maintain towards princes, and tends rather to diminish their just power and greatness than to increase and preserve it, and instead of being a proper way of defending their persons and authority, is rather a mean to bring the wrath of a just and jealous God both upon them and these who defend or connive at them in these unlawful courses. Quote, our own consciences within, and God's judgments upon us without, do convince us of the manifold wilful renewed breaches of the fourth article, which concerneth the discovery of malignance consonant to the Scriptures. Unquote. 2 Samuel 23, verse 6, quote, but the sons of Belial shall be all of them as thorns thrust away, because they cannot be taken with hands. Unquote. Esther 7, verses 5 and 6, quote, then the king Ahasuerus answered and said unto Esther the queen, who is he, and where is he that durst presume in his heart to do so? And Esther said, the adversary and enemy is this wicked Haman. Unquote. Psalm 26, verse 5, quote, I have hated the congregations of evildoers, and will not sit with the wicked. Unquote. Psalm 101, verse 8, quote, I will early destroy all the wicked of the land, that I may cut off all evildoers from the city of the Lord. Unquote. Proverbs 25, verse 5, quote, take away the wicked from before the king, and his throne shall be established in righteousness. Unquote. Quote, for their crimes have not only been connived at, but dispensed with and pardoned, and themselves received into intimate fellowship, and trusted with councils, admitted into parliaments, and put in places of power and authority for managing the public affairs of the kingdom, whereby in God's justice they got at last into their hands the whole power and strength of the kingdom, both in judicatories and armies, and did employ the same unto the enacting and prosecuting an unlawful engagement in war against the kingdom of England, notwithstanding of the dissent of many considerable members of Parliament, who had given constant proof of their integrity in the cause from the beginning, of many faithful testimonies and free warnings of the servants of God, of the supplications of many synods, presbyteries, and shires, and the declaration of the General Assembly and their commissioners to the contrary, which engagement as if it was the cause of much sin, so also of much misery and calamity unto this land, and held forth the grievousness of our sin, in complying with malignants, in the greatness of our judgment, that we may be taught never to split again upon the same rock upon which the Lord hath set so remarkable a beacon. And after all that is come to pass unto us, because of this our trespass, and after that grace hath been showed unto our fathers and unto us, and again from the Lord our God, by breaking these men's yoke from off their in our neck, and sometimes delivering our fathers so far from their insultings, that he put them in a capacity to act for the good of religion, their own safety, and the peace and safety of the kingdoms, should they and we again break the commandment and covenant of the Lord, by joining once more with the people of these abominations, and taking unto our bosom these serpents, which had formerly stung us almost unto death. This, as it would argue great madness and folly upon our part, so no doubt, if it be not avoided, will provoke the Lord against us, to consume us until there be no remnant nor escaping in the land. Many times have we been warned of the sin of not complying, many times have we been warned of the sin of complying with malignants, both by faithful ministers and fatherly corrections from the Lord." Unquote. Yet after all these punishments, and after all these mercies in mitigating these punishments, we have again joined with the people of these abominations. The Lord is righteous, for we remain yet escaped as it is this day. Behold, we are before him in our trespasses. We cannot stand before him because of this. These incendiaries, malignants, and evil instruments made many grievous encroachments, and prevailed much in the days of our fathers, but not without dissent, testimonies, warnings, and declarations. But more especially in the dismal days of persecution and tyranny they were suffered, yea, encouraged, without any significant joint testimony, not only to hinder the reformation of religion, but to overturn the whole work of reformation, to burn and bury the covenants for it, to reestablish abjured prelacy, erect a monstrous Christ-exacerating and church-enslaving supremacy, attempt the introduction of popery and slavery at the gate of an anti-Christian toleration, and to persecute and destroy the godly, who durst not in conscience comply with them, and not only to divide the king from his people, or one of the kingdoms from another, but first to divide the bulk and body of both kingdoms, and make them pursue divided interests from the interest and cause of Christ, and then to divide the remnant of such as had adhered to it amongst themselves by indulgences and other bonds of contention, in order to get them more easily destroyed, and at length to engage the king into such a division from the people as to make him, instead of their protector, their declared destroyer, and not only to make parties among the people contrary to this league and covenant, but to draw and divide the whole people into a party with perjuries. The generality notwithstanding did own allegiance to the head of these incendiaries and malignants, yea, a popish incendiary, because he wore a crown on his head, and did pay the cess imposed for the maintenance and encouragement of malignants. Many did associate with them in expeditions of war, drawing up with them in their musters and rendezvous, thereby countenancing a malignant cause, and lifting themselves under a malignant, yea, popish banner. Many subscribed and swore themselves contrary to the covenants by taking tests, oaths, and bonds, obliging them to surcease from covenanted duties, and to keep the peace and good behavior with them whom they were obliged by covenant to seek to bring to punishment. Yea, some, and not a few, were inveigled in the snare of the oath of delation, to delate the persecute people of God to their courts, and thereby made, instead of discovering malignants according to the covenant, to discover their brethren to malignants. And very many, almost the universality of the land, were involved in the snare of the oath of abjuration, renouncing the principle of declaring war against a malignant king, and of asserting the lawfulness of bringing his mothering compliances and incendiaries to condign punishment. But, on the other hand, some of the suffering party did sometimes exceed the bounds of moderation in this matter, in usurping the sword without God's call, without respect to the rule, and against the scope of their own declarations, to take vengeance on them at their own hand, yea, even to that degree of taking the lives of some of them in an extravagant manner, for which they were sadly rebuked of God, and occasion was given and taken to reproach and blaspheme the way of God upon that account.